Welcome into a special edition of the Fast Lane. Trey Lyle here with you, previewing the Virginia Tech Hokies. I am joined by the managing editor of TechSideline.com, David Cunningham, my good friend. You hear him most weeks during covering the Commonwealth. Now we're going to do a long form again, once again, second year in a row. We're previewing the Virginia Tech Hokies. This time under Brent Pry. It is a new era at Virginia Tech, and looking back at the end of last season, it really felt on as the middle of the season hit. It was a win not if situation under Justin Fuente. But the Brent Pry hire was a little shocking. He kind of came off the radar. What are your initial assessments of the Brent Pry era visiting practices? Obviously, spring practice. What has this vibe been around the team?
Yeah, Trey, first of all, great to be with you. I appreciate you guys having me on. I think the biggest thing is the culture's different. And Brent Pry made an effort day one. He wanted to go out and change the culture. He wanted to, one, make it more fun, make it more, I don't want to say relaxing, but let the guys have a personality. I think that was something that was lacking. It was more just, I think Caleb Smith, a wide receiver, kind of said something interesting when we chatted with him at ACC Media Day in Charlotte back in July. He said the old staff wouldn't let him celebrate in practice, after they scored a touchdown or something. Like even something as simple as that. Brent Pry has basically said, look, be yourself. You got to be serious about it. But the culture has really changed, and you can tell the players have bought in. And on top of that, it was great. A couple of weeks ago, the ACC Network crew was in town for practice and chat. I got to chat with Eddie Royal, along with Mark Packer and Kelsey Riggs. And Eddie Royal said, man, the alumni, the former player reach out, that or outreach to those guys has just it's just a complete 180. It's changed so much. So between the culture as a whole with the current players and then the updated or the new culture and the vibe with the former players, which are both very important, and are both things that weren't necessarily in the right place with the previous regime. I think Brett Price got off, to the right foot, and really the culture is the place you have to start. You have to have a good culture to have a good football team, and Brent Pryce emphasized competitiveness, and he's got coaches in there that emphasize competitiveness. And I think above all else, whether the Hokies win 5 games or 8 games this year, you will see a competitive football team that looks like a Virginia Tech team of the past, which is, hard nosed, blue collar. We're going to try to, you know, knock you down as soon as you walk in the front door. And,
Would you say
that
a
that's,
lunch pail style?
yeah, I mean,
You
sure.
see what
Yeah,
I did
sure.
there?
Yeah. But I mean, but that's how Brent Pry wants to play. And, I think this is going to be it's going to be an interesting year because how does that account for wins and losses on the field? I'm not exactly sure, but I do think this will be a fun, entertaining team to watch.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point about the former players. I remember when we went to the spring game, how many former players were there that entire weekend. We went to an event Friday night, and it was surrounded by former players from Tyrod Taylor to guys that played when I was there, and you were there too. Um, and so it just showed the wide range of connectivity this team has had. And I think it comes back to, Brent Pry was a GA under, Frank Beamer. And he's talked multiple times how Coach Beamer and Coach Foster have had an influence on him in his coaching career. And, throw in James Franklin, who's that kind of culture guy. And, you look at Penn State and what they've built. Can you see those kind of a mixture of those three, three great coaches kind of in the fabric of the football team?
Yeah, well, I will say this first and foremost. A lot of the stuff that Tech does is kind of the Penn State way. That's just kind of how it goes. And you had to think, Brent Pry with James Franklin at Vanderbilt, then at Penn State. Two really good friends who have been together for a long time. And I'm one of the things we were talking with Brent Pry yesterday on Wednesday after practice, and somebody asked him about Ricky Ronnie, the OU head coach, who of course was James Franklin's former offensive coordinator. So, he and Brett Pry were the two coordinators in James Franklin's, team. And they're going to butt heads next, Friday, September 2nd at Old Dominion. And I'd be curious to know how much James Franklin really rubbed off on Ricky Ronnie, just like it did on Brent Pry. But yeah, once you think about the culture, I think the culture is very similar to that of what Frank Beamer would have emulated. And I think the schemes, especially defensively, is very similar to what Bud emulated. I think it's more of an advanced defense, but a very similar style to what Bud Foster played. And then as far as a lot of the game day operations and just the way you run your football program, I think that is very similar to James Franklin, what he did. So yeah, I think you can see, especially when you're covering the program and you're chatting with different people inside and outside, I think it's very obvious that those three people have really had an influence on Brett Pry in this program.
All right, now it's time to talk about some actual football, which is pretty good to say. Season's right around the corner, as you mentioned, the opener against Old Dominion, which you can listen to live on CBS Sports Radio Lynchburg or VCR in Southside 106.3. Obviously, CBS Sports Radio Lynchburg 93.3 FM, 1320 AM. So your home for the Hokies is CBS Sports Radio Lynchburg. As for offensive coordinator Tyler Bowen, who was with Brent Pry at Penn State, had a year in the NFL with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Don't know if he's going to take much from that given the situation in Jacksonville last year, but let's look at this offense. They tab Tyler. I almost said Tyler Bowen as the starting quarterback. No, they tab Grant Wells as the starting quarterback, the Marshall transfer. But what do you expect to see from this offense? What type of style do you expect them to bring this offense this season?
Well, I think Tyler Bowen, first and foremost, is more of a run first kind of coordinator, or he will be. But I think it also depends on what kind of assets he has. Right now, as we're speaking on Thursday, August 25th, Malachi Thomas is week to week, and running back Jalen Holston was unavailable at practice the last two practices, the media observed. If Virginia Tech is down its top two running backs, that creates a problem. Now, the good news is Grant Wells has a huge arm, is a very accurate quarterback, and I think Tech would have relied on him a lot anyway. So I don't think it's that much more, but Grant Wells is going to be a name Tech fans are going to remember, I think. He's a very talented quarterback. He's very smart, very accurate. He's deceptively quick, has some legs, can move. But I think as Brad Glenn, the quarterbacks coach, and Tyler Bowen and Brent Pry have all talked about, he is a very good deep ball. Now, how do the receivers look? But I think in general, this is going to be a quarterback that one, he has two extra years of eligibility after this, so he could potentially be Virginia Tech starter for 3 years, which is something the Hokie fans haven't seen since Michael Brewer, Logan Thomas. That kind of quarterback consistency. Um, but
When
I
I
think
was a
in general,
freshman, just let's put it that way. When I was a freshman,
yeah. Well, I mean, 2012, 2013 for Logan Thomas. I mean, Michael Brewer would have played back-to-back seasons, except he got injured in
yeah.
2015. But just in general, like this is even behind Grant Wells, Jason Brown is a pretty good option too. So I think the Hokies have a solid fit at quarterback. I think it kind of just depends on injuries and everything else that kind of falls in around them, because if if Malachi Thomas or Jalen Holston can go and Tech has sort of a running game, then it's more balanced, obviously. But I think how Tyler Bowen and that offense look kind of depends on what guys are available.
Well, David, this must be a sign we spend way too much time together since you became a student at Virginia Tech, because my next question was about that quarterback and Grant Wells and finally getting stability, the 3 years of eligibility left, which includes this season. There's never been a consistent starter for an entire season. It's felt like, really since Gerard Evans, who you knew was going to be the starter all season. And then ever since then, it's felt like the quick hook came for the other quarterback, or they would rotate them out, whether that was a good or bad decision by the coaching staff. Um, how does it feel kind of in that locker room amongst that offensive staff that it kind of the sense of, all right, Grant's come in. He was going to be our guy originally. That's our plan. We were going to let Jason kind of compete for it, but Grant was the presumed starter. He's been kind of the presumed starter all along, and now he's going to be our starter, and we're not going to change that. How is that kind of, amongst the receivers, the running backs, even the offensive line to some degree, that there's just kind of consistency in the quarterback room, which kind of didn't really happen towards the end of the Justin Fuente era?
Yeah, I don't know if the coaching staff was like, "Hey, Grant Wells is going to be our starter," especially when they brought Jason in. But I do think they kind of knew what they were going to get with both Grant Wells and Jason Brown, and I do think that Grant Wells had the advantage or was in the lead for most of the quarterback competition, just because I think he's the better quarterback. Um, I I think having quarterback consistency is probably one of the biggest assets in college football, just as a whole, and maybe even in professional football too. But like you can't, no, if Grant Wells is here for multiple years in Blacksburg, that and keep in mind that now it's the first time in a while that the Virginia Tech offensive coordinator is Tyler Bowen, who is the tight ends coach as well. Brad Glenn is simply only the quarterbacks coach. He doesn't have to worry about anything else. And Grant Wells and Brad Glenn talked about that a couple weeks ago. Just how much more individualized a lot of the stuff is. Grant Wells feels like he has taken a lot of strides, and having a quarterback only coach is kind of a piece of to why. And I think if Wells is now the starter, assuming he stays healthy, I think he can have a bright future at Virginia Tech, especially because I think that he's going to get essentially individualized training. I mean, you got a quarterbacks coach who has four quarterbacks, and Grant Wells is one of them. So, he's going to be taking the most reps. So it's much easier for Brad Glenn to work with him than it is some of the others. So I think Grant Wells is clearly a future in the quarterback room, and I'm very curious to see one how he looks this season. But I do think he's going to be the guy for the next couple of years. And when it comes to quarterback stability, again, that's something that Virginia Tech hasn't had in a really long time. Gerard Evans was the quarterback in 2016, but after that, Josh Jackson in 2017, I feel like that was a pretty locked down year. But then Josh Jackson got hurt in 2018 at Old Dominion, which ironically is the first place Virginia Tech has to play this year. And it kind of just was hectic over the next couple of years of the Justin Fuente era from there. So it would be I think from everybody, I think it would be a welcome change to kind of have a guy nailed down for at least this year and maybe a couple other years.
And Grant Wells has played against Old Dominion, obviously, both seasons because of the Conference USA ties. He was 30 of 46, 299 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, which brings me to my next question about the quarterback. And we'll break down the rest of the offense in a second. But interceptions has kind of been his biggest flaw, and turnovers. How important will it be for Grant, with this receiving core that he's going to deal with obviously Caleb Smith, Nick Gallo, probably the two biggest returners. And then you can throw in the transfer and Jaden Blue in there. How big is just limiting his turnovers this season going to be, for him?
Yeah, well, he said when we got a chance to chat with him, Grant Wells said one of the biggest things is offseason, and he knew coming into the offseason after last season, he was not happy with it. Was he needed to slow the game down and stop forcing things. And chatting with him in mid-August, he had talking with him and Brad Glenn. Glenn felt like he had done that, and Wells said he felt like he started to slow the game down, and it come easier to him, and he stopped forcing things. And I think that's big. I don't know what kind of change we'll see immediately, but I think Wells he's very kind of Ryan. If you're familiar with Virginia Tech, he's kind of like a Ryan Willis type guy who just sling the ball all around the field because he has that type of NFL arm. Ryan Willis, say what you will, he spent some time in the Chicago Bears organization just because of the talent he has, especially when it comes to arm strength. And I think Grant Wells is way more accurate. But I will say it's going to be interesting to see when he actually gets out on the field September 2nd against ODU. How much does he force things? But to hear him say that, Wells essentially said that he's learned to not force as much, and I think that is a welcoming um, music to Tech fans' ears. And he was good at Marshall, but I think interceptions kind of limited his effectiveness. And if he can kind of narrow those down or get rid of most of those, I think he can be even more effective at Virginia Tech. And again, it helps when you have your position coach is only your position coach. He gets to work with Brad Glenn every single day. You get to come off the practice field and have one-on-one conversations with Brad Glenn without either of one of them having to worry about anything else. So I think it's a good system, especially like the good. It's a good way it works, especially when it comes to quarterbacks and quarterbacks coach. And I think Grant Wells is in for a pretty good year. I'm interested to see how September 2nd goes for him.
It's a good way to put it, my friend. And moving on to the running back position, you talked about the injuries. This is a depleted group without Malachi Thomas and Jalen Holston who are banged up right now. And you talked about the emphasis to run the football with a really good offensive line that's returning a lot in the interior. No Brock Hoffman at center, but the guard is coming back. They have with Caden Moore, so that they do have some, so Latita Smith is obviously gone into the NFL. So there is some returning to that offensive line, so which could be arguably the strength of this offense. So the running back room, how is it looking? Do you expect Malachi Thomas and Jalen Holston, if they're healthy, to get most of the carries? Is there maybe someone that could surprise some people this season?
I would expect Malachi Thomas and Jalen Holston to get most of the carries if they're healthy. Um, Running backs coach Stu Hull described them as 1A and 1B a couple weeks ago. Unfortunately, both of them are not healthy right now. Keyshawn King, I think, has come a long way. Brent Pryce said he's the team's most explosive player, and I think he's a guy that Tech's going to get the ball in space to. He might have to do a little bit more in the backfield depending on the injury situation. Besides that, the other three guys, Bryce Duke, Kenji Christian, and I'm forgetting one. Um, Chance Black. I think those three guys are they're very young guys that I wouldn't expect them to come along right away. They could be used here or there, but I think if you've got King and Black and Holston, that's a pretty good running back trio. And Malachi Thomas, I think one of the biggest things I'm curious about when it comes to this new staff is when you got a guy who's that talented like Malachi Thomas, assuming he's healthy, what are his carries looking like? Because there were times where a guy like Raheem Blackshear, who was absolutely tearing it up in Buffalo this year in the NFL preseason, had good game, had potential to go off in some games last year, and he just didn't get the carries. Why is that? And does this Virginia Tech staff, if they have a guy who is capable of that, do they feed him the rock? I think they will. And then you asked a little bit about up front on the offensive line. I think it's interesting. Tech essentially has four guys who've started games before, a fifth in left guard Jesse Hansen, who has appeared and played meaningful snaps in college football games. Then after that, they have nobody else who has played meaningful collegiate snaps. That is what the offensive line is looking like. So I think the biggest question to me on the entire football team right now is what is the offensive line depth? Because if a Virginia Tech offensive tackle interior, it's not as bad. They've got a little bit of depth, a little bit of talented guys that just haven't played yet. Um, if an offensive tackle at Virginia Tech goes down, it is going to be a long season.
Yeah, I was gonna. That's my big question. Was I think the offensive line could be the strength of the offense, as I mentioned, but the depth, and that's a theme kind of throughout this team. Which honestly, if you have a coaching change, and is the biggest issue, is you could have really good talent. The front line depth could be really good. There's good players there, but it's the rest that kind of through transfers or people just leaving that you lose, and the next coach has to build that back up. How big of an issue is depth, not just on the offensive line, but throughout the team?
Just depth in general.
Yes. How is this? You know, is this a deep team? Is depth going to be kind of maybe the biggest issue with this team because there is talent throughout the offense and we'll get into the defense in a second, but it's once injuries are going to happen. This is football; it's a violent game. That second, third unit coming in, and it might not be. I'm not saying they're not talented; it's just experience in that back half of that roster is just not there compared to like you know a Miami and like-minded teams in the up hit, like-minded teams in the coastal.
Yeah, I think
And obviously, I picked the top two there, but you get my point.
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting. Um, I think Tech has some depth across the board. I think the biggest thing is there are just guys who have not. There are guys who've gotten that were very talented who've just not gotten meaningful college reps. I think that's the biggest thing. They're fine in terms of quarterback depth, running back depth, tight end depth, wide receiver depth is questionable. Wide receiver and offensive line depth is questionable. They're fine on the defensive line to both end and tackle. They're okay at linebacker. I guess it could be better. And at corner, they're all right. And at safety, they're fine. So I think it's mostly just offensive line and wide receiver is where there is a lack of depth. But I think it's more so it seems like they have a lot of talented guys, but who's going to step up? There have not been guys that have played meaningful college snaps, so they have no experience. So you don't know really what it's going to be like for them. So I think there's a lot of potential there in terms of Virginia Tech football depth. It's kind of just it hasn't been tapped into, if that makes sense.
That's a better way. Maybe just lack of experience is a better way to put it instead of lack of depth. And that's why they pay you the big bucks, and I just make Ed sound good. So moving on to the defense, uh, talking about a new defensive coordinator, Chris Marv, obviously played under Brent Pry, was at Florida State last year. You already touched on this. This defense is going to look very similar to a Brent Pry or a Bud Foster. It's going to definitely look like a Brent Pry defense, but it's definitely going to look like a similar to a Bud Foster style defense, which you could argue Brent Pry kind of modernized at Penn State, where he had really talented linebackers, really talented corners, and they call it linebacker U kind of with the mantra at Penn State. Obviously, you look at Micah Parsons, who's tearing it up in the NFL. Joey Porter Jr. Is really good and is at Penn State right now. I is someone I think of off the top of my head. But do you expect the key to be linebacker play, and you're looking at your Dax Hollifield and your Alan Tisdale as kind of the centerpieces of this defense, and they're going to build it out from there?
This season or just down
This
the
season,
road?
this season, this season.
Yeah, I would honestly, I would expect. I think the one weakest spot in this defense might be the linebackers. That's my perception of it. I think the defensive line is going to be one of the biggest strengths on this football team. I think they don't necessarily have a guy that's gonna he's going to rack up sacks left and right. But they've got some guys who can make stuff happen, and not just starters, but guys in the two deep that are very talented. I think a guy like Cole Nelson, CJ McCray, those are two guys who who really have a lot of potential. It's kind of just getting them out on the field um, and letting them go to work. I think in the secondary, Armani Chapman and of course Dorian Strong, who's going to be Tech's number one cornerback, the go-to guy. Those are two guys that return a whole lot of experience. Breon Murray's back there; he's pretty solid too. Okay, can you find a fourth cornerback? Is that DJ Harvey? If it is, that's a pretty solid quartet of cornerbacks. And then you go to safety. Well, you got Chamari Connor and Nasir Peoples there along with a couple other young guys behind them. Okay, those are two of the most experienced guys on this football team at safety. So then it comes to linebacker, and who knows how much Alan Tisdale will play because Jaden Keller is progressing quickly. But I think yes, Dax Hollifield is a leader, and of course Sam linebacker is a whole new position for the Hokies. So I think linebacker is kind of defensively the area where I'm not exactly sure what to expect. I think I think more it's more so because that's where the scheme has kind of changed the most, if that makes sense. It's no longer like two a Mike and a backer and a whip linebacker. It's a Mike, a Sam, and a Will. If that's the football terminology for you. But I think in general, yes, I think this will be a talented defense this year. I think it'll come down to how the defensive line plays, how much pressure the defensive line can get, because if the defensive line can get a lot of pressure, it'll make life easier for everybody else. But I do think it'll be interesting to see how Chris Marv and Brent Pry, who Pry has said, he's going to call most of the plays this year in year one defensively. I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting when we go out against ODU and we're covering them and to go, oh, okay, this is kind of what the defense looks like. I wasn't sure what to expect, but what do you know? It looks exactly like a Bud Foster defense. It's exactly what I would have pictured.
Yeah, and I I think you summed up the defense pretty well there. The defensive line, which has been the strength of the defense, probably under Justin Fuente, it's kind of the similar issues. Like linebacker was interchangeable at some points, but defensive line stayed consistent, and corner was really good. Obviously, Caleb Farley being the first round pick and the talent that came there. So let's just talk about who are two guys. Maybe you can pick one offense, one defense that no one, or maybe majority of Tech fans don't know, but by the time we're 3-4 games in the season, I'm like, oh, this guy's really good, and I'm excited to see him the rest of the year.
I will pick. Well, I'll pick one guy first of all that guys might people in Hokie Nation might know. It's wide receiver Dewan Lawson, and he's been around for a year or two now. Or I
He's a
believe
sophomore, I
yeah,
believe. I was looking
he's
at
a
the
sophomore.
roster.
So he played last year a little bit. He was hyped up, and I think he's a very talented guy. I'm curious to see what he could do in his second year with new wide receiver coach Fontel Mines and kind of what his development in the offseason was like. In terms of guys nobody's ever heard of, Xavier Chaplin. He's going to play some. He will play left tackle for Virginia Tech. He's about 6'6", 335. He's a big giant guy. True freshman, I should add, out of South Carolina. He's a very, very talented guy. Silas Janzi, when he leaves, Chaplin's basically going to be a 3-4 year starter kind of thing. Um, Chaplin's going to be a really talented guy. Next to him, Braylon Moore, the brother of Caden Moore. I think he's got a future at left guard. I don't know how much he'll play, but he's a guy to keep an eye on. Defensively, Jaden Keller is a big name to watch. Jaden Keller is a guy who I don't expect him to start right away, but he will have an impact this year at will linebacker. He could potentially transition over to Mike linebacker next year when Dax Hollifield leaves. I don't know kind of the coaching staff and what kind of depth they have at each position, but and behind that, I think Mansour Delane. He is a true freshman safety slash corner. Very kind of he can kind of do both. And he's a guy, he's been a little nicked up throughout fall camp, but Brent Pry's really excited about him and just kind of what he brings to the table. Will he up Tech this year? They're not exactly sure, but he's a guy who, if he didn't help you this year, I'll give you another name. Cole Nelson, I think, is a guy who is on the younger side who has been around this program for a year or two, but he hasn't gotten a chance necessarily because there were older guys in front of him. He's a defensive end, and I think he could have a big impact this year, opposite of veteran Taiwan Garbett and alongside a guy like CJ McCray. I think those are kind of the younger names on the really, really talented side that Hokies fans should know.
Well, looking out west, the win total for Virginia Tech was 6.5. We've mentioned on air that we maybe not wouldn't bet this necessarily because you never know with the new coaching staff what this team could be like. But what are your expectations if you had to pick an over or under? Do you think they could get to 7 wins this season?
If I had to bet and if I had to put my own money on an over or an under, I would bet 7 wins.
So over. Okay.
I would bet the over. Um, my would you like to? I assume you would like to hear my prediction.
Yes. Well, if you unless you want to save it for your great work at techsideline.com, I will
Well,
tell you
no, 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 no.
I
No,
agree
Trey,
with you.
you were very important. Of course, I will give it to you.
Okay.
Let me say this: if I had to put my own money down, I would bet on 7 wins, just because I think this is a talented team. That the biggest issue is there's a lack of depth or slash experience. That is the one thing, the one big question mark about this team. Besides that, if you put out Virginia Tech starting 22 against most teams in the ACC, Virginia Tech would win probably most games, just because it is an above average starting 22. It's guys who have experience. Everybody's healthy. Virginia Tech is winning a good number of games. I think the schedule lines up to where September and November are much easier stretches. Then you've got a 5 week stretch where you've got North Carolina, Pitt, NC State on the road with Miami in a bye week squeezed in there. That is going to be one a heck of a stretch. But I think that's only 5 games, and if Tech can steal one of those, I think I in my predictions, I have picked Tech as 6-6. I think the ceiling is 8-4 and the floor is 5-7, but I am going to go conservative and pick 6-6. I think Tech will likely have a better year than that, but for my own predictions, I'm going to pick 6-6 just because I am worried my worry is that week 2 of the season, one of your offensive tackles goes down for the season and you are screwed from there on out. And if that so happens, there's not much Tech can do. And Tech season, the entire outlook is changed. So I think just from an injury sake, okay, if some guy gets hurt, it's going to be very scary perspective. And who knows what's going to happen with that. I'm going to go conservative and say Tech's going to go 6-6. Again, if I had to put my own money on it, I would bet 7 wins. But I do think this is a team that if it got on a roll and everybody's healthy, could win 7, maybe even 8 games in year one under Brent Pry. I do think a successful year in year one is getting to a bowl game and making a bowl game. So that means at least 6 wins and winning a bowl game. I think that would be a pretty big accomplishment.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that assessment. I always thought I've seen the number down at 6 and on some places because I think I grabbed it like the number when it first came out. I think it's gone down to 6. And in my head, I'm like, Virginia Tech's fabric is going 6-6 or going like getting to a bowl game. They don't historically have gone 6-6, but their fabric is we're Virginia Tech. We're going to get to a bowl game, and that's 6-6. And I really could see this is kind of what see the schedule like. Tech starts 4-0 because you have at ODU, home to Boston College, home against Wofford, home against West Virginia. I think you could easily win those 4 games. Maybe BC's your hardest in that because I believe in Djokovic more than I do JT Daniels. And then that stretch in September at North Carolina, at Pitt, home against Miami, at NC State. Easily could see them losing those 4 games because the talent level on those 4 teams are probably better at this point. And then Georgia Tech could probably not have a head coach by the time they play them. At Duke, Duke's maybe the worst team in the Power Five. At Liberty, don't know what they're going to look like with Charlie Brewer or who their quarterback is going to be. Going to talk to Damian Sordelet about that. And then home against Virginia, I don't believe in the Cavaliers. I've said on the show, I think take their under 7.5. Their offensive line issues are too big to miss. Their defensive issues are too big to miss. So I completely agree with you. David, thanks so much for joining me. How can our listeners connect with you and your great content? You have previews of every position group on techsideline.com. How can they connect with you?
Yeah, well, I would say go to techsideline.com, but you can become a subscriber today. Uh, you can become a monthly or annual subscriber. And if you choose to become a monthly subscriber, you get a first month free. It's $10 a month. Um, we have tons of content there. We also share it on social media. You can follow us at Tech Sideline on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can follow me at the Real D Cunningham on Twitter. Of course, full time beat writer, travel, covers the team and everything. And you can also check out our Tech Sideline podcast. You can find that on YouTube or Apple Music or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. We've had some really good guests on. We'll preview the season coming up starting next week. We've got fall camp recap coming up today. So we've got a lot of good stuff going on techsideline.com, on our YouTube channel and our podcast stuff. So I'm really excited about the season. It's a nice change of pace from past years. New blood in Merriman and kind of just in the practice facility and stuff. And there's a new vibe around the team, and it's been fun to cover. Again, I'm not exactly sure how well Tech is going to do this year. I would expect 6 wins at least. But it's going to be a fun season, no doubt.
I completely agree. The best in the business, David Cunningham. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, you can connect with me at TreyLyleVT or at Fastlane, Ed Lane, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. As always, you can listen to a special edition of the Fastlane on our YouTube channel or the Fastlane with Ed Lane podcast feed or SoundCloud. Youngblood DC, as I gave you that name one of the first times we met back in college. It is good to see you, my friend, and we'll see you. We'll talk to you throughout the season.
Sounds good to me, Trey. Thanks for having me on, and can't wait to chat with you and Ed. We need to get you on these shows more when I'm on there than me just having a
Mondays are
one on
busy,
one with Ed.
man. I
Yeah,
got
I
to call
know.
6 people. It's busy. Mondays are
Yeah,
busy in the fast lane, but we will definitely do it. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this special edition of the Fast Lane, previewing the Virginia Tech Hokies. Like last season, we'll have tons of previews of every game for Tech, UVA, Liberty, talking to beat writers, giving their thoughts on the game and what they think will happen. Thank you so much for listening to this special edition of the Fast Lane.